Robertson.
Mr. Speaker, this government is committed to keeping everyone in this country safe, whether you live in a town, a city or in a rural area. That's why we're putting more police officers and PCSOs on the beat, and it's why we've bolstered the Crown Prosecution Service's workforce. With specific regard to rural crime, Mr. Speaker, we're committed to implementing the Equipment Theft Prevention Act and the continued funding of the National Rural Crime Unit.
David Robertson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I'm sure the Solicitor General knows, fly tipping is the most commonly reported rural crime. And in 2022-23, the last year where there's full data, there were well over 13,000 significant multi-load incidents, and I use the phrase specifically as it's an internal description. They cost more than £4 million to clear up, and yet there were just 22 custodial sentences handed out in that time. What assurances can you give to me and my constituents that the most egregious examples of fly tipping, like we saw in Lichfield 2 weeks ago, will result in jail time for the perpetrators?
Mr. General.
Mr. Speaker, fly tipping blights communities, and I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for raising this issue. I know he's also raised it with the Minister for Rural Affairs, but I'm happy to arrange a meeting with his local Chief Crown Prosecutor to discuss this matter further.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Ben Maguire.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The tragic hit-and-run case in my rural North Cornwall constituency of Ryan Sultan and many other cases across the country highlights a concerning problem in our legal system. The driver failed to stop, failed to render aid at the scene, or even call 999, leaving Ryan for dead. The case was heard in a magistrates' court where the driver received a 4-month suspended sentence. Ryan's parents, Helen and Mark, and sister Leanne, have campaigned tirelessly on this issue. Can I ask the Solicitor General to please look into this issue in conjunction with the CPS and Department for Transport, and to meet with me to discuss her findings?
Solicitor General.
Mr. Speaker, this is a profoundly tragic case, and I'm very grateful to the honourable member for raising it. My heartfelt condolences go to Ryan's family. I know they and others have been campaigning for changes to the law in this area and supporting families who have been through similarly tragic circumstances. I'll make sure to discuss this case that he raises with my colleagues at the Ministry of Justice and ensure that he receives a full response.
Yeah. Tom Gordon.
Question 9, Mr. Speaker, please.
Solicitor General.
Mr. Speaker, whether online or in person, stirring up hatred or inciting violence will not be tolerated. This government is determined to take swift and robust action to stamp out hate crime, and perpetrators will face the full force of the law.
Tom Gordon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. February marks LGBT History Month, and last night many people came together at Mr. Speaker's house to hear about the progress that's been made in tackling hate crime against the LGBT community. I wondered if the Solicitor General would be able to outline what support and steps have been taken to ensure that trans people in particular feel safe and their perpetrators of hate crime towards trans people are brought to justice.
Solicitor General.
Mr. Speaker, the CPS prosecutes all cases that are referred to it, provided that they meet the full code test for Crown prosecutors. I think we'd all admit, the CPS and the Police National Hate Crime leads, I think we'd all admit rather that there's more to do, indeed the instance to which he refers. The CPS and Police National Hate Crime leads are committed to joint working to increase the number of police referrals to the CPS for hate crime offences.
The Select Committee, Andy Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Most grateful. The Criminal Legal Aid Advisory Board has asked the government to raise fees in rape and serious sexual offences cases to address the shortage of advocates. But prosecutors often earn 30 to 40% less than defence barristers in the same case. Does the Solicitor General think she should have a look at fees to make sure there isn't a shortage of advocates going forward, particularly in these serious cases?
Solicitor General.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right to identify this as a problem. I know from discussions with RASO charities in my own constituency that the shortage of counsel is a direct contributor to cases being adjourned or delayed. It contributes to the unfortunate slow pace of justice and, of course, to victim attrition as part of that process. Ministers at the Ministry of Justice have committed to working with the bar leadership via the Criminal Legal Aid Advisory Board and to look at the longer-term reform of legal aid.
That completes questions. We'll let the front bench change over. We now come to the urgent question. Andy MacDonald.
Speaker, to ask the Foreign Secretary if he will make a statement on the situation in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for raising this important question and indeed for this being granted. I know the whole House will be well aware that for the people of Gaza, so many of whom have lost lives, homes or loved ones, the last 14 months of conflict have been a living nightmare. The UK is clear that we must see a negotiated two-state solution with a sovereign Palestinian state, which includes the West Bank and Gaza, alongside a safe and secure Israel with Jerusalem as the shared capital. That has been the framework for peace for decades, Mr. Speaker. Our priority remains ensuring the fragile ceasefire continues, that all the hostages are released, that much needed aid gets into Gaza and that we can indeed rebuild that pathway to sustainable peace. Palestinians must determine the future of Gaza with support from regional states and the wider international community. We would oppose, Mr. Speaker, any effort to move Palestinians in Gaza to neighbouring Arab states against their will. There must be no forced displacement of Palestinians nor any reduction in the territory of the Gaza Strip. Palestinian civilians should be able to return to and rebuild their homes and their lives. That is a right guaranteed under international law. Gaza is home to 2 million Palestinians and remains an integral part of what must become a future Palestinian state, with Palestinians living next to Israelis in peace and security. The US have played a critical role in negotiating the ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas, alongside Qatar and Egypt. As members may know, the Prime Minister reiterated this in his call with President Trump. We must now work together to ensure the ceasefire is implemented in full and becomes permanent. The UK is investing in the ceasefire by doing all we can to support the surge in aid that's needed. Alongside our existing support on the 28th of January, I announced a further £17 million in funding to ensure healthcare, food and shelter reaches tens of thousands of civilians and to support vital infrastructure across the occupied Palestinian territories and neighbouring countries. We're also concerned, Mr. Speaker, at the expansion of the Government of Israel's war aims and operations in the West Bank. Stability is essential at this crucial time. We recognise Israel's right to defend itself from the continuing threat posed by armed groups, but it must show restraint and ensure the scale and conduct of its operations are commensurate to the threat posed. Civilians must be protected and the destruction of civilian infrastructure minimised. The UK remains opposed to illegal settlements, their expansion and settler violence. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, our attention must now turn to how we secure a permanently better future for the Israeli and Palestinian peoples, grounded, to reiterate the point a final time, in a two-state solution.
Andy MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for her statement. The context in which we approach this question is following 16 months of bloodshed and the deaths of almost 50,000 Palestinians and a welcome temporary ceasefire. So the remarks of the US President in conference with the Israeli PM that the US will take over the Gaza Strip to create a Riviera of the Middle East and 1.8 million Palestinians living in Gaza should live in other countries are reckless and dangerous. This has emboldened the Israeli Defence Minister Katz overnight to further propose the displacement of Palestinians from Gaza. These remarks are creating and generating fear and tension in the Palestinian population and across the Middle East, as evidenced by the statements of Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia and others, and will cause concern and more determined demonstrations in the UK. The US President has also restored arms shipments, ended funding to UNRWA and withdrawn from the UN Human Rights Council. Netanyahu says Israel will redraw the map, and the IDF has detonated whole streets in the Jenin refugee camp in the West Bank. In such dangerous circumstances, we should be careful, calculated and accurate in our use of language. Forced displacement of the type advocated, and which has already occurred within the Gaza Strip, is a breach of international humanitarian rights and is a war crime. Advocating the expulsion of people is also justly described as ethnic cleansing and can only be achieved through yet further appalling violence. I acknowledge the government will wish to maintain a diplomatic relationship with the US as a long-standing friend, but it is the role of friends to be honest with each other, and the UK must use its influence. The Prime Minister's remarks yesterday that the Palestinians must be allowed home is most welcome, but I believe the government must go further. So, will the Minister set out that the UK rejects the President's remarks and those of the Israeli Prime Minister and Defence Minister? Will she confirm that the recognition of the Palestinian state is an urgent necessity in resolving this conflict? Will she confirm that the borders of that state are the 1967 borders set out in UN Security Council Resolution 242? And when will the UK government respond to the ICJ advisory opinion on the Israeli occupation of the occupied Palestinian territories? Thank you, Mr.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to my honourable friend for the many points that he has made. Of course, he is right to underline the appalling suffering that so many Gazans have experienced over recent months. Of course, we also recognise the suffering of the hostages and of their families as well. This has been a truly horrendous time for Gazans, for Palestinians, for Israelis, and we must see that ceasefire being held to not just phase 1, of course, but phase 2, phase 3, and ultimately a two-state solution. He talks about the role of Egypt, Jordan and Saudi Arabia, and I want to reassure him that the UK continues to work with all partners in the region towards the peace that is so important. He mentioned UNRWA, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure he's aware of the UK government's position that we believe that UNRWA must continue to operate, not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank and in relation to Palestinian refugees more broadly in the region. He also mentioned the situation in Jenin, Mr. Speaker, and we've been very clear there must be de-escalation. We're deeply concerned about the potential for further instability because of recent developments. On his primary question, Mr. Speaker, around displacement, he did refer to the Prime Minister's statement yesterday, and I want to underline that briefly, Mr. Speaker, because the Prime Minister could not have been clearer in what he said. He stated that he was moved by the image of thousands of Palestinians literally walking through the rubble to try and find their homes and communities in Gaza, as so many of us have been moved. He stated, and I quote, "They must be allowed home. They must be allowed to rebuild. We should be with them in that rebuild on the way to a two-state solution." So the UK's position on this has been crystal clear. That is the position of the UK government. I do not believe there is any confusion around that, and I do appreciate that he was not suggesting that, Mr. Speaker. He asked about the UK's position on recognition. He will be aware again that we have stated that position a number of times in the House, including the Foreign Secretary at length when we had his statement on the ceasefire deal when that was agreed. We are very clear that the Palestinians have the right to their own sovereign state where they can live in security, just as with Israelis, and we are determined to ensure that there is recognition at a time that is most conducive to achieving that two-state solution that is the right of both of those peoples. And finally, on the subject, Mr. Speaker, of the ICJ, he will be well aware that that determination by the ICJ is a very detailed judgment. It's one that took many months to come to. As behoves such a detailed judgment, it's important the government considers it in detail. That is exactly what we are doing, and of course we will update colleagues as soon as we have come to a determination in relation to that. Thank you.
Shadow Minister Wennemore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The ceasefire remains fragile. There continues to be a long road ahead, and we do want this agreement to hold. That means each and every single hostage must be released, both in accordance with the terms of phase 1 of this agreement and subsequently. The videos we have all watched of the released hostages being reunited with their families are immensely moving. We cannot even begin to think or imagine the pain they have suffered since October the 7th, 2023. We also hold firmly in our thoughts the hostages who remain in such cruel captivity at the hands of Hamas, and the families who continue to anxiously await news of their loved ones. The awful news that 8 hostages will not be making it home alive must be unbearable for the families. So we again reiterate our call for the government to do everything in its power with partners to push for humanitarian access to those who are still being held hostage. And the UK should offer whatever practical support it can to help facilitate the smooth release of hostages. Mr Speaker, the testimony of Emily Damari about the location of her captivity is also very serious, and there needs to be a thorough and independent investigation, and urgently. So today I would also be grateful for clarity from the Minister about how the UK Government is formally responding beyond calls for an investigation. On the subject of aid to Gaza, can she provide an update to the House on 3 specific points? Firstly, the turnaround time between British aid reaching warehouses in the region and then entering Gaza. Second, what metrics, if any, the government is using to monitor the distribution of that aid when it has entered Gaza. And finally, whether additional types and categories of aid are now being delivered versus before the ceasefire. Mr Speaker, thank you.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Lady for all of her questions, but also, of course, for the concern that she expressed about the situation for the hostages and those who remain, and of course their families. I had the privilege of meeting the brother of Emily Damari when I was in Tel Aviv, and some other hostage families, and obviously their suffering has been extreme, and clearly, as she said, it's been particularly harrowing for those the families of the 8 hostages who have died. In addition to that, of course, I know the whole House will recognise the pain and suffering that has been undergone by the very large number of Gazans who have lost their lives, of course, the large numbers of unaccounted for people. And I think, Mr Speaker, it would be almost unimaginable for many of us to put ourselves in the shoes of some of those returning now to their former homes, in some cases seeking to find out whether their family members are under the rubble. What a horrific experience they must be going through at the moment. She asked 3 specific questions, Mr Speaker, that I will get onto in just a moment, but she did press rightly on the situation in relation to Emily Damari's captivity and the fact that there were allegations that Emily Damari had been held in UNRWA facilities. Commissioner Lazzarini, who's the head of UNRWA, has stated that claims that hostages have been held in UNRWA premises are disturbing. I agree with him. I welcome UNRWA's call for independent investigations into any misuse of its facilities, as indeed has been the case previously. And of course, the Colonna report was investigating other allegations, and the UK has worked with UNRWA to ensure that those investigations have been thorough and that the appropriate changes have been made. On her specific questions, Mr Speaker, she asked about the turnaround times for UK aid getting into Gaza. Certainly we have seen a far speedier throughput of aid getting into Gaza, Mr Speaker. We do, however, need to see a situation, and I'm sure she would agree with me, where commercial shipments of goods are actually getting into Gaza. That is going to be necessary for the scale of food and other supplies that is required there. So we continue to push the government of Israel to enable that as quickly as possible. In terms of the metrics that are being used around the distribution of that aid, we're working closely with trusted partners on this. We continuously monitor the distribution of UK supplies, as she would expect. Now, much of our activity has been joint with other countries as well as with UN agencies, and we're working really closely with them on this because we need to make sure that aid is delivered where it's needed. And then lastly, Mr Speaker, she asked whether there had been a change in the types of aid. We do need to see, of course, access for tents in particular, other forms of shelter, for medical supplies. When I was in Jordan, I saw some medical supplies that had not been able to be delivered into Gaza, so we need to see access for those. We've seen improvements in some areas, but we need to see further improvements there, given the scale of the challenge. And I'll just say finally, Mr Speaker, that's especially the case when it comes to water and sanitation, where we've seen a lot of destruction, and there needs to be quite urgent action to set that in a better position. Thank you.
Can I just say to those who are 7 minutes late, please don't embarrass each other by standing. Laura Kirk-Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've seen a really worrying escalation of violence in the West Bank at the same time as this fragile peace has been found in Gaza. Large parts of Jenin refugee camp have been completely destroyed by Israeli security forces, and thousands have been forcibly displaced. UNRWA services have been interrupted. What measures is the Minister taking to ensure that Palestinians can live safely and securely in their homes in the West Bank?
Minister.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for raising this issue, and of course she has considerable expertise in the area of humanitarian support, as do many other members in the Chamber. The UK is very concerned, as I said in my previous response, about the situation in Jenin, which we continue to monitor very carefully. We are clear that peace and stability in the West Bank is in everyone's interest, Mr. Speaker, in the State of Israel's interest as well as for Palestinians. And on the 18th of December, the UK called on Israel to stop illegal settlement expansion on Palestinian land. That was in a statement to the UN Security Council meeting on the occupied Palestinian territories, and we're considering all options to take further action.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Monica Harding.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. President Trump's proposals for the forced displacement of Gaza's 2.2 million inhabitants would constitute a grave violation of international law, threatens the fragile ceasefire and the return of the hostages. Will the Minister condemn them? Mr. Speaker, the Palestinian people have a right to self-determination and to a state of their own, as has been British policy for decades. So will the government now finally commit to an immediate recognition of a Palestinian state along the 1967 borders? The welcome ceasefire has given us the opportunity to flood Gaza with aid, but the freeze to US aid funding is reportedly impacting the humanitarian response as NGOs are forced to lay off aid workers. So will the Minister share what the impact has been on the humanitarian response in Gaza, including British-funded programmes, and what conversations is the government having with our American partners to persuade them that abolishing US aid would be a dire mistake?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for the important points that she has raised. Mr. Speaker, the UK's position on the right to return could not be clearer. I quoted previously the Prime Minister's remarks on this, which were most definitely in strong relief that Palestinians who are going back to their homes and communities in Gaza must be allowed home, they must be allowed to rebuild, and of course that is in line with international law, Mr. Speaker, so there's no doubt about the UK's position on this whatsoever. She asked about the position on recognition, Mr. Speaker. I responded to that when it came to the words of my honourable friend who raised this urgent question. The UK has been clear around this, that we believe that it is important that both Palestinians and Israelis are able to have sovereignty that is required for them, able to have security that is necessary in order to live in peace, and we will ensure that the UK's decision around this on recognition is a contribution to the process towards a two-state solution that we desperately need to see. And finally, Mr. Speaker, she asked about US aid, and I was very grateful to her and other members in the room for coming to a briefing that we undertook yesterday with the Minister for the Middle East, where we covered this matter as well. So we obviously, as the UK, note the US decision to pause foreign aid funding for 3 months pending a review. Of course, there has been a lot of commentary around this. This is a fast-moving situation, but it's one that we are monitoring very closely indeed, as she would expect. Of course, this is a matter for the United States. We are very clear as the UK, Mr. Speaker, that we must continue to do what we can to support people in Gaza, that we must provide that life-sustaining support, that we must work with a whole range of partners on this, and we will continue to do so. Thank you.
Phil Brittle.
Mr. Speaker, vast swathes of infrastructure in Gaza have been destroyed. So what work is the government undertaking to support the Palestinian people, rebuild their homes and their communities, as is their right under international law?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, this is a critical issue. Of course, we need to see the ceasefire being held to. We have to move, as I said before, through phase 1 to phase 2 and 3, but we do also need to ensure that there is day after next phase planning in Gaza, so that we can see that building up of Gaza's governance and security institutions and, of course, infrastructure as well, as my honourable friend rightly stated. We're clear that Gaza's recovery and reconstruction must be Palestinian-led. We have supported the Palestinian Authority in particular in relation to this. I'm very proud that we have UK expertise which has been supporting that work so that that important reconstruction can continue at the required pace and scale. But of course, we need to see the ceasefire holding in order to enable that.
David Mundell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the Minister what practical support the government is giving to Egypt now that the Rafah crossing has reopened for medical emergencies? When that was the case previously, it placed enormous pressure on the Egyptian health service and caused some civil unrest in Egypt because of that. And as the Right Honourable Lady knows, Egypt is also under pressure on its southern border from the conflict in Sudan. So does she agree with me that support for Egypt at this critical time is very important?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for underlining the role of Egypt in relation to this incredibly difficult humanitarian situation, and particularly in relation to medically evacuated people from Gaza. Of course, it's also right to underline the fact that Egypt is now housing many refugees from Sudan as well. The UK is, I can reassure him, seeking to work with Egypt around this. We have supported the Egyptian Ministry of Health and Population with £1 million. That was delivered through the World Health Organization, WHO Egypt, to support medically evacuated Palestinians from Gaza. We're exploring further support to the Egyptian system because they are, of course, as he knows, gearing up to receive large numbers of medical evacuees at the moment. Thank you.
Hussein.
Mr. Speaker, the world is watching, and let us be clear in this House that how the UK reacts to this brazen attempt to further rip up international law today will echo for generations. 61,000 Palestinians killed, a ceasefire hanging on a thread, and a blueprint now to ravage Gaza, ethnically cleanse Palestinians and resettle the land. So can the Minister tell this House where exactly has diplomacy and refusing to sanction Israel led us when Palestinians are now facing mass expulsion, reoccupation and resettlement, all whilst the international rules-based order has been ripped to shreds?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for his question. I believe it has been incredibly important for the UK to engage diplomatically in relation to this conflict. I think it's absolutely right that we have sought to work with partners on these issues, that we have supported, for example, statements within the UN Security Council, that we have worked with partners in the region, that we have sought to achieve change, that we've sought to ensure that that ceasefire which was agreed was achieved. The release of hostages, we need to see more release, that surge of aid into Gaza, and ultimately that we work with other countries towards the two-state solution that is so necessary. I believe that has been important, Mr. Speaker, and I believe that members in this House would not have forgiven the UK government if we had not engaged in those actions determinedly. He asked about the UK's position and referred to the situation in relation to right to return particularly. We again have stated this very clearly, indeed at the highest level, with the Prime Minister's statement on this yesterday, when he said that those who are literally walking through the rubble to try and get back to their homes and communities in Gaza must be allowed home. And of course, in saying that, he is restating international law, Mr. Speaker.
Malthouse.
But, Mr. Speaker, does the Minister not accept that how we got here is after 16 months of weakness and vacillation by this government and the one previously, as we contemplate, as she said, hundreds of thousands of people returning to their homes to dig their relatives out from under the rubble, the welcome return of hostages, the 40,000 odd orphans and even more amputees, does she not recognise that the hot air that we've heard from both governments, frankly, has got us to a situation where the Israelis are demolishing buildings in Jenin with people still inside them, and the President of the United States openly contemplating the forcible transfer of the Palestinians? And if she accepts that vacillation, could she, just for the avoidance of doubt, confirm a couple of things? First of all, are Arabs, and particularly Palestinians, entitled to the same protections under international law as everybody else? And secondly, do we still affirm our support for UN Security Council Resolution 3236, which guarantees the Palestinians safety, security and sovereignty in their own land? And if that's the case, when is she going to stop just talking about it and actually take steps and action to enforce these matters in law?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Right Honourable Member is aware, and indeed we discussed this previously, this UK government has taken a different approach to the previous government on matters of accountability. We were very clear that the UK's arms export regime had to be held to, that it had to be operated in line with international humanitarian law. That underwrote the decisions that we took in autumn. As we said we would examine that regime and deliver on it, we did examine that regime and suspend a number of licences. He's also aware about the new UK government's different position in relation to the legitimacy of the ICC, of the ICJ and also of UNRWA, and of course he is aware that we resumed funding to UNRWA as well. I believe it's important, as I said before, and I don't want to labour the point because there's so many members who want to get in. I believe it's important the UK has engaged in diplomacy around this, that we have sought to work with our partners, and I believe members would expect the UK government to do that, to engage with the UN on these matters rather than to walk away, Mr. Speaker. Of course, I would underline that international law is universal. It must be. That is its founding principle. It operates regardless of circumstance, regardless of which population and which individuals we are talking about. And we have been very clear on his last point about that right to return. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, the TV footage of many thousands of Palestinian men, women and children walking back to northern Gaza was a powerful reminder not just of the forcible displacement they've already suffered, but also of the extraordinary resilience of that people. And so that's why there's real anger amongst Palestinians today that yet again the very existence of their homeland is being subject to the whims of another colonial power. I'm pleased that the Minister has confirmed that the UK has an unshakable policy on the right of return of those Palestinians to rebuild their homes and their lives. But would she agree with the UN Secretary-General, who says today that staying true to international law is essential to avoid any form of ethnic cleansing?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to my honourable friend for again raising those images that so many of us have seen on our television screens of Palestinians returning to their homes in Gaza. As the Prime Minister explained, having to walk, in many cases, of course, having no other choice because of the destruction of roads and other infrastructure, seeking to walk back to their homes, of course, so many of those homes having been destroyed. And of course, he is right that that experience of displacement is one that has been felt by very significant numbers of Gazans, up to 90% of Gazans having been displaced at least once and some up to 9 times, Mr. Speaker. The UK's commitment to international law, Mr. Speaker, to underline yet another time, is very clear. The Prime Minister has restated that, the Foreign Secretary has restated that, and I restate it again today. Thank you.
Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful to the Minister for a response to my honourable friend in relation to US aid, and to know that the impact assessment of the US Government's decision in relation to US aid is ongoing, particularly in relation to the humanitarian situation in Gaza. But can I ask the Minister, when we are looking at overseas development assistance, surely as part of that assessment, should the government not be considering a return to 0.7 of overseas development assistance? Because if the US is no longer a reliable partner, a global partner, surely the UK should be.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. First of all, when it comes to the UK's position on the return to 0.7% of GNI being spent on overseas development, she will be aware of my party's position, the position of the government, that we are determined to return to that level of spending as fiscal circumstances allow. We are very clear that we must play our part on these humanitarian questions, and indeed more broadly on development. We must seek to work in partnership with other countries on these matters, and we are doing that. Indeed, we have made sure that's fed into our decisions for the next year for the spending review that's 1 year long, Mr. Speaker, but it will also be the case for the longer term spending review as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister from that dispatch box was quite clear. The right of Gazans to return and remain on their land is absolute.
Hear, hear.
As they return, of course, there are many hundreds of thousands of psychologically and physically damaged children, which is unprecedented in recent memory. What can we do, Minister, to help them as a British state?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I know this is an issue that my honourable friend will be concerned about, also given his considerable medical expertise as well. The UK has been acting to ensure that we are doing our part to support children within Gaza. We will continue to do that. We're having urgent discussions now, Mr. Speaker, with our partners around this, and that does extend to those really concerning issues around psychosocial trauma that has been experienced by children, and ensuring that those vulnerable children do receive the support that they need in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's welcome news that some hostages have been released, but the shocking scenes we've seen of brave young women surrounded by terrorists demonstrates that Hamas is still in charge in Gaza. So the question now turns to how we can ensure that the Palestinian people can return to safe and secure homes, that the terror tunnels are destroyed, and that Hamas play no part in the governance of Gaza. Given that they are in charge, and now President Trump has made an announcement about how this could be done, what is the British government going to do to come up with a counter-proposal that is both reasonable and achievable?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I share his concern around those scenes, and I'm sure that other members within the House will have done so as well. The UK government has been very clear: Hamas must not play a part in those future governance arrangements, and we have practically been seeking to work, as I mentioned previously, Mr. Speaker, with the Palestinian Authority, especially making sure that they have the expertise that they need for their reform programme, and working towards the reconstruction and recovery that's so important in Gaza. Thank you.
The Minister is right to say that the last 14 months in Gaza have been a living nightmare, and that what we need to do now is see a safe and secure Palestine alongside a safe and secure Israel. I agree absolutely that there must be no forced displacement of Gazans. So can the Minister say more about how we are focusing on the key issues here, which is how the UK is supporting a ceasefire and the rebuilding of Gaza?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to my friend for her important question. The UK has sought to invest in the ceasefire. That was the reason why we announced, in fact, I think it was just last week, Mr. Speaker, additional support to go in, humanitarian support in relation to much needed services in Gaza, so that we could ensure that surge in aid, which is so necessary, is not just there now, but will be sustained. We believe that's important, Mr. Speaker, so that we can progress from phase 1 of the ceasefire into phase 2, then phase 3, and ultimately towards a two-state solution. Thank you.
Dave Dougal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No amount of rowing back by the US State Department can change that what the United States President intimated earlier on this week amounts to ethnic cleansing. Is the UK government of the same view that what his plan would amount to, if prosecuted, would be ethnic cleansing? And if not, what does the UK government understand ethnic cleansing to be? And I've heard an awful lot of warm words from the government and ambition about what we believe in, what we stand for, what we've delivered around the immediate humanitarian crisis. But don't let's forget that the horrors that have happened over the last 18 months are because of the vacuum that has been created by international inaction over the plight of the Palestinians for the last 50 years. What will this government do to change that drastic situation?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I did list the decisions that the UK government took, which were different from those of the previous government a few moments ago. We have been determined to ensure that when it comes to the ICC and the ICJ, for example, that we're very clear about their jurisdiction, that also we remove that ban on UNRWA funding as well, and that we've supported, for example, moves at the UN through the Security Council that have been specifically focused on trying to push forward the two-state solution that is so important. And, Mr Speaker, I'd refer to my previous remarks about the Prime Minister himself underlining the importance of that right to return. Thank you.
Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Yesterday we welcomed the Prime Minister's comments saying that Palestinians must be allowed home, they must be allowed to rebuild, and we should be with them in that rebuild on the way to a two-state solution. Yet settler violence continues to increase against Palestinians. So would the Minister confirm that this government has no intention of lifting the sanctions the UK has imposed on Israeli settlers and settler groups? And in fact, would it consider expanding those sanctions?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My honourable friend, I'm sure, will be aware that the UK has imposed, I believe it's in autumn, sanctions against those who had engaged in and promoted violence as settlers. We condemn that activity. We believe that it reduces the prospect for a two-state solution. Of course, when it comes to future sanctions designations, for me to talk about them from the dispatch box, Mr Speaker, would reduce their efficacy, and therefore I will not do that here. Thank you.
Sir Alex Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. May I start by thanking the Minister for the clarity of her answers today. Mr Speaker, we're all aware that Iran played a major role through their anti-Semitic regime in funding Hamas, in funding Hezbollah, with the stated aim of destroying the state of Israel. Therefore, may I ask the Minister, if there is to be faith in the reconstruction of Gaza, people who want to do that are going to have faith that there is a secure situation. The attitude of the White House towards Iran is different to the previous one. So may I ask the Minister what action the government is taking, how it is involved in making sure that Iran is not able to re-establish itself to fund and arm the groups that specifically want to destroy the state of Israel?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm grateful to the honourable member for his comments, and the UK government is clear that Iran has long destabilised the Middle East. That's obviously been through military means, but also financial and political support as well to its proxies and partners, including Iranian-aligned militia groups in Iraq and Syria, Hezbollah, as he mentioned, in Lebanon, and the Houthis in Yemen as well. We will continue, Mr Speaker, to work with international partners to encourage de-escalation. Long-term peace and security in the Middle East can't be achieved without addressing Iran's destabilising activity. The UK government is very clear on that. Thank you.
Richard Bagan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Trump has lifted the lid on Israel's real plan, the ethnic cleansing, the forced displacement of Palestinians. Nobody can any longer claim that they didn't know and don't know what's going on, a genocide. And all the warm words in the world about a two-state solution won't stop this. Only sanctions will, as the world's top court demands. And that means bans on Israeli settlement goods entering this country. It means sanctions on trade. It means an arms embargo. Without doing that, people and this House will never be able to say that we did everything that we could to stop these crimes that will echo down the generations. So will the Minister finally agree to confirming that the government will finally treat Israel as it's rightly treated Russia and impose widespread sanctions?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And on my honourable friend's question in relation to forced displacement, I was very clear earlier, Mr Speaker, about the fact that the UK government is absolutely determined to ensure that there is not forced displacement. That would be contrary to international law. Gazans must be allowed home, and in the words of the Prime Minister himself, they must be allowed to rebuild, Mr. Speaker. He asked about the situation in relation to arms exports. I know that my honourable friend will be aware that on the 2nd of September we suspended a number of export licences to Israel for use in military operations in Gaza, and I refer him to my previous response in relation to sanctions designations, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Ellie Chance.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, President Trump's comments earlier this week were grossly irresponsible and dangerous. Can I ask the Minister, does she recognise that forcible displacement of a population under occupation constitutes ethnic cleansing and is a war crime? Will she clearly and unequivocally condemn the remarks of President Trump? And will she recognise the state of Palestine as an essential step to the long-term sustainable peace she has articulated support for? Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for her question. We have been very clear, as I mentioned just a few seconds ago, about the fact that any attempt to prevent Gazans from returning home, to prevent them from returning to their communities, to suggest that, for example, they must be housed and remained in other Arab states, any attempt to do that would be contrary to international law. And she, I'm sure, understands that. She's not just heard me say it, she will have heard the Prime Minister say it, of course, yesterday, and the Foreign Secretary has said it many times. She asked about our approach in relation to recognition. Mr. Speaker, I agree with her that lever of recognition is an important one, that it will be crucial for ensuring the two-state solution that is going to be so important for peace in the region, Mr. Speaker. That is why the UK is considering so carefully how we go about this, because we know that ultimately both Israelis and Palestinians have that right to be able to live in sovereign states in security, and we're going to make sure that our actions are as strong as possible to getting us to that outcome. Thank you.
John Pearce.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome the Minister's unequivocal commitment to a two-state solution, and the Government is right to reject anything that risks undermining the ceasefire and the release of the remaining hostages. But no top-down political solution is going to be sustainable unless we build trust between Israelis and Palestinian communities and support the peace builders of the future. The Prime Minister has committed the UK to taking a lead on an international fund for peace between Israelis and Palestinians. Can the Minister please provide an update on what progress is being made on that fund?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for what he stated about the clarity of the UK's position when it comes to peace building. I know this is an issue that he is passionate about, as well as many others within this chamber. It's also an area, of course, Mr. Speaker, where the UK does have a certain amount of expertise derived, for example, from those who've been peace building within Northern Ireland, but in other contexts as well. It really is important that we seek to contribute towards this, Mr. Speaker. Of course, the most urgent thing, Mr. Speaker, is to ensure that the ceasefire is held to, that we move from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3. But of course, in the future, it will be important to do what we can to contribute to peace building. He's right about the Prime Minister's announcement, and we are right now considering how we can ensure that's delivered. Thank you.
Robin Moore.
Mr. Speaker, I've been kindly contacted by many constituents, including Maggie Gardner, who have all contacted me deeply concerned about the well-being of Dr. Hussam Abu Shafia, who has been detained by the IDF. I've written to the Foreign Secretary on this, and I know that the government has raised this issue with the Israeli authorities. So can I ask the Minister, what explanation has been received in those meetings, and what further work is the Home Secretary undertaking to obtain more detail about this very important case?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to his constituent for raising this important issue. As he says, it's one that many members are concerned about and the general public are concerned about. As he rightly states, this is an issue that the UK government has raised with Israeli counterparts. We are concerned about this situation. We believe that there needs to be clarity about why any individuals are being held. That includes medical staff. And it is also absolutely crucial that, of course, the Red Cross are able to visit those who have been detained. So we've made that point very forcefully. Thank you.
Andy Slot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Since the ceasefire in Gaza, there has been open warfare against civilians in the West Bank, dehumanising of the whole Palestinian population and the threat of ethnic cleansing of a second Nakba. Surely we can expect a proportionate response from the UK government, starting with the advisory opinion, with recognition and with the banning of trade on settlements.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising the situation in the West Bank. We are deeply concerned by the intensity of IDF military operations in the West Bank and attacks from Palestinian militants as well. We do recognise Israel's need to defend itself against security threats, but we are deeply worried by the methods Israel's employed and by reports of civilian casualties, Mr. Speaker, and the destruction of civilian infrastructure. We're very clear. It's in no one's interest to see further conflict and instability. Thank you.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the commitment and the given to the House today by the Minister and the determination over showing our opposition to this disgraceful approach by Trump. But I'm disappointed that she does not see this as the ideal moment in which to commit to recognising the state of Palestine. But also, can she tell us what is being done across government to reassure the communities in this country who've suffered outrageous abuse since October the 7th in 2023?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do want to underline to the honourable lady that we've been very clear. Palestinian statehood is the right of the Palestinian people. It's not in the gift of any neighbour. We're clear that it's essential to the long-term security of Israel as well. And the UK is working with partners to support a path to long-term peace and stability with a two-state solution. On the issue of abuse, Mr. Speaker, and it was quite right that she raised this, of course the UK government condemns any form of abuse. We've seen a disturbing rise, Mr. Speaker, in anti-Semitism, also in Islamophobia. All forms of hatred must be condemned and acted against, and of course we're working hard against that, and particularly from the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. How does the government address Amnesty International's concerns that economic activities with illegal Israeli settlements contribute to both their sustainability and growth, thus undermining Palestinians' rights, and that business enterprises involved with Israel's illegal settlements may be involved and complicit in international crimes?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we're very clear. Israeli efforts to undermine a two-state solution through settlement building, settlement violence and punitive economic measures are unacceptable. We're aware that settlement expansion reached record levels in the past year. That was very disturbing, and that has been accompanied, of course, by an increase in settler violence. And our position on this has been clear. I will reiterate briefly, Mr. Speaker. We know that settlements are illegal under international law. They present an obstacle to peace, and they threaten the physical viability of a two-state solution.
Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The current ceasefire is clearly welcome, but fragile, given Israel seems determined to pursue a policy of expansionism. We see the bombings in Jenin, we've seen the expansion to southern Lebanon and also into the buffer zone of the Golan Heights. And they will only be emboldened by the irresponsible ramblings of the new US president. So does she agree with me that we are actually witnessing ethnic cleansing? And can I urge the UK government to lead at the United Nations with a new resolution for a Marshall Plan to ensure the rebuilding of Gaza on the terms of the Palestinian people?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to him for raising the issue of the role that the UK can play when it comes to the recovery and rebuilding of Gaza. We have been working with a range of partners around this. As I mentioned before, Mr. Speaker, we've been seeking to support the Palestinian Authority on this, contributing experts towards their endeavours in relation to that. And the World Bank has conducted another damage assessment, an updated damage assessment. We're looking very closely at that and seeking to work with them and other partners on this, Mr. Speaker.
Speaker. Any proposal that would oversee the forcible transfer of the entire population of Gaza would clearly constitute an egregious breach of international humanitarian law, but also amount to ethnic cleansing. Now, the government has previously emphasised the importance of a rules-based international order underpinned by adherence to international humanitarian law. But how does the government hope to defend and strengthen that order when it appears that yet another permanent member of the United Nations Security Council seems intent on dismantling it?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful for his words, making clear that the UK government does indeed support a rules-based international order. That's particularly important when it comes to, of course, international law, international humanitarian law, as well as we have been discussing, Mr. Speaker. We have made that position clear repeatedly. We will continue to hold to it, including within the UN and with all of our partners. Thank you.
Rachel Muskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know that the ceasefire is incredibly fragile and that there have been breaches with impunity, particularly we think about the people of Jenin at this time. However, does the Minister recognise that the lack of recognition of Palestine now is denying the protection that people across Palestine need?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That protection is critically important at every stage, Mr. Speaker. The UK government has been absolutely clear that we have seen too much, far too much death and destruction in Gaza, Mr. Speaker, that we are seeing now truly heartrending scenes of people trying to return to communities that have been destroyed. We have seen over 46,000 people being killed, Mr. Speaker. That population requires our support, and I do not believe that is contingent on political circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Minister for her update yesterday. It's greatly appreciated. But would the Minister agree with me that we are standing on the precipice of a new dangerous world order, leaving one behind that bases global peace on global justices that we have recognised? Because we have close to 48,000 Palestinian men, women and children being killed. Hundreds of thousands returning to once was their homes to rubble, and as we speak, Minister, mothers are looking for their children in the rubble. Whilst at the same time, we have the most powerful man of the most powerful country in the world behaving like a gangster, talking about replacing these people from their land, replacing their homes with beachfront properties, creating casinos and a Riviera. Is this the time, Minister, where we categorically utilise the same words as we do for other conflicts and call this out for what it is, and that is the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people? And we must immediately put into place the recognition of a Palestinian state. Can we stand up to President Trump and tell him Gaza is not for sale? Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I stated in response to the previous question, the UK has been and will continue to be an advocate for the international rules-based order. That's incredibly important. We need to see those rules being upheld by all, and of course we will continue to advocate for that at the UN and in relation to all countries, Mr. Speaker. We've been very clear about our position. It must be possible for people to return. I agree with him about the horrendous situation so many Gazans are facing. We've already talked about this in this urgent question, Mr. Speaker, and I would just underline again what the Prime Minister said yesterday very clearly. When it comes to Gazans returning to their homes and communities, they must be allowed home. Thank you.
Jacob Collier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The comments made by the President of the United States about a Riviera of the Middle East undermine the hard work towards a two-state solution, which, as the Minister has said, is the only way for a lasting peace in the region. Can the Minister confirm that it will be for the Palestinian people to determine the destiny of their country?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for asking me to confirm that it will be for the Palestinian people to determine their future of Gaza. Absolutely, we've been crystal clear on that, and indeed, as I stated previously, we've been working with the Palestinian Authority in relation to this. Thank you.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Minister for her answers to the UQ? Let me be clear in the first instance that, not having seen the full detail of Trump's plans for Gaza, I believe that I need to see more detail, and I think we should all look at that more astutely. But what I very much want, Mr. Speaker, is a future for Gaza that can see a barren wasteland of death and destruction to become something of value, with jobs, economy and safety. Israel needs a secure border that safeguards Israeli citizens so that Hamas terrorists, murderers, rapists and child killers can't murder Israeli people. And remember that China and Iran has stood alongside Hamas. Will the Minister consent to keeping an open mind and dialogue to a fresh approach to help those in Israel and in the Gaza Strip? Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure that members right across the House want to ensure that there is, in the future, within Gaza, a situation that is economically viable. That's one of many reasons why commercial operations have to be allowed to resume. It's really important the Government of Israel enables that. But we also, of course, need to see a situation for Gazans and for all Palestinians of security and of sovereignty, as I talked about before, as well as, of course, for Israelis. When he talks about economic empowerment, this is an issue that's been crucial for the UK government. I saw that for myself with Palestinians when I visited the West Bank, some of the support the UK has been engaged in there, and we will continue that work. Thank you.
Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for securing this important question today. Over the last 16 or so months, we have seen Palestinian people being displaced from their homes and communities, on many occasions, on not just once, but perhaps twice or three times. So for the President of the United States to suggest a further forced displacement seems to me to be not just illegal, but also incredibly cruel. In diplomacy, we believe that timing is everything. So in order to give the Palestinian people some protection from outside actors who seem to wish to dictate what should happen to them, is it not now the time that the international community and our government should recognise Palestine as a state and give it all the international supports and strengths that that gives it?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my honourable friend was right to refer to the levels of displacement. As I said previously, Mr. Speaker, 90% of the population of Gaza have been displaced. As she says, some twice or three times, some up to 9 times having been displaced. And when we consider the impact on whole families having to move so many times, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that we're all disturbed by that. She is right that timing is important. Of course it is. That is why the UK government is considering this so carefully. We must use the mechanisms we have available to us, Mr. Speaker, to ensure, above all, that we get to a two-state solution and the peace that is the right of Palestinians and Israelis. Thank you.
Joe Powell.
Mr. Speaker, the devastation in Gaza needs a strong international coalition focused on reconstruction, humanitarian aid and a pathway to a negotiated two-state solution with a viable Palestinian state, not speculation about handing over territory and forced displacement. And on humanitarian aid, there are now 2 pieces of legislation that have come into effect that will ban UNRWA operations in areas under Israeli occupation. So can the Minister outline what actions this government is taking to prevent the largest humanitarian aid operation in Gaza collapsing and the devastating consequences that will have on Palestinians?
Minister.
My honourable friend is right, Mr. Speaker. Gaza's recovery needs are going to be vast. They're extremely serious. The UK is engaged with partners on assessing these and working together so that we can ensure that the unprecedented scale of destruction in Gaza is remediated, and that is going to require, for example, innovative financing mechanisms, and above all, it must be a process that, as I mentioned before, Mr. Speaker, is driven by Palestinians. He talked about UNRWA, Mr. Speaker. I discussed that situation with the Emergency Relief Coordinator a few days ago. We continue to work with partners around this. The UK government's position on UNRWA has been articulated a number of times from this dispatch box. We believe they must be able to continue to operate. Thank you.
Final question, Chris Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let us be clear. Palestinian land belongs to the Palestinians, and any implication that they should be forced from it should be unequivocally condemned. But individual Palestinians are routinely forced from their land by illegal settlement building in the West Bank. Will the Minister join me in unequivocally condemning illegal settlement building in the West Bank?
Minister.
Yes, and having seen that activity from myself, Mr. Speaker, and the impact that it has had on Palestinians and their families, the violence that has often accompanied it and the economic damage that it has done, I'm very well convinced of that, and indeed the UK Government has been and has stated that many times. Thank you.
Thank you. Let the front benches change over. We now come to business questions. Shadow Leader of the House, Jessie Norman.
Will the Leader of the House...
And has stated that many times.